Hi, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your week off last week. Last week was a rather light week that I gave you off in order to be able to get some work done. This week, what we're going to do is jump right back into the content area of the class schedule. And this week, we're going to be talking about the continued use of the death penalty here in the United States. And over the last couple decades, it has remained a rather controversial issue in terms of debate. But I feel like in the last few years especially, we've sort of seen a resurgence of that debate, and it's gotten a little bit more heated than it has in past years. So when we're talking about capital punishment or the use of the death penalty, we're really talking about the execution of an offender who has predominantly killed somebody else. There's a little bit of wiggle room there in terms of offense, but predominantly the offender has killed somebody else, whether it's just an outright homicide or somebody died in the commission of a felony, something to that extent. But normally we're talking about a crime in which a victim has ended up being deceased. Majority of the states that use the death penalty predominantly execute for first degree or capital homicide, depending on the state that we're talking about and what they call it, or felony murder. There are federal statutes on the books for acts of terrorism, treason, espionage, and other related types of crimes, but for the most part, we see the death penalty being used at the state level rather than at the federal level. I think it's been at least a decade or two since the federal government has actually executed anybody at all. But like I said, predominantly we're talking about offenses in which the victim has died. And we also tend to execute more frequently now than we have in the early 70s. I would also say that what's interesting about the use of the death penalty for us is that we are we are actually the only industrialized country that still uses the death penalty. So when I'm talking about industrialized countries, we're normally talking about countries that make up the G8. So sometimes you hear on the news about the G8 summit. It means the 8 industrialized countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, Russia, and then the European Union make up the G8. The one that sort of stands out there is the idea of Russia, and that might be surprising to you, but capital punishment from the government has really been suspended in Russia. Even though it's still codified in law, it just really has been suspended by the government. So President Yeltsin in 1996 placed a moratorium on the death penalty. However, we know that sometimes this infrequently will happen behind the scenes and is done covertly by the government, but not necessarily through the formal court processing. Since 1996, in which President Yeltsin suspended the death penalty in Russia, there hasn't been a formalized execution by the state since that point in time. But like I said, there have been a lot more covert activities happening in Russia than are considered legitimate, I guess I want to say. Okay, but back to the United States. So I feel like even though it has been very controversial, especially in the last few years, and we'll talk about why in a little bit, support for the death penalty has kind of ebbed and flowed. And currently we're in a time period in which support for the death penalty is pretty low. And we've seen that support kind of be fluid throughout the years. But right now there is a very strong opposition to the death penalty, in which nationwide, it might differ based on state, but nationwide, the majority of people are opposed to the death penalty compared to being in support of it. And these numbers are somewhat reflective of the trends that we've seen take place in the early 1900s, but really the support for the death penalty kicks in the country post-World War II. So we're seeing a lot of support happen 1945 onward until we get to the 1970s. And during that time period from 1945 until 1970, what we're seeing is a lot of mistakes happening with the death penalty. We're seeing the death penalty be applied to juveniles. We're seeing it being applied to minorities more so than whites. And we're seeing it being applied to a variety of different crimes that are not necessarily uniform in nature. So a lot of inmates have gotten together, they've put together this joint suit, and they're going to petition the Supreme Court, and they're going to say the continued use of the death penalty is unconstitutional. And in this case, in 1972, in Furman v. Georgia, like I said, is a collective suit. I think it comes from Georgia, Texas, Georgia obviously because that's in the case name, but inmates in Texas and a few other states as well are going to petition in this case and say that the continued use of the death penalty is unconstitutional. So really that argument is being made on the basis of uniformity, and their argument is that there was no uniform application of the punishment across the board. SCOTUS actually agrees with these inmates, and in 1972 the death penalty is abolished nationwide. So they argue that the death penalty is in violation of the Eighth Amendment under the Cruel and Unusual Punishment Clause, and the federal government basically puts a de facto moratorium on the death penalty, and it's a blanket sort of judgment. So everybody who's currently on death row at the federal level or at the state level, their sentence gets vacated and they're resentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. So part of that argument is that the death penalty is not being used only in homicide cases. Instead, it's being applied to rapists who did not kill their victim, to juveniles, to the mentally ill, and then the biggest issue was the issue of race. So there was a large proportion of African Americans specifically that were being sentenced to death row and who were being executed over white inmates, despite the fact that the rates of the crimes they were committing were similar for both racial groups. So the court is basically saying that there is an arbitrary application happening here. If we have two racial groups, whites and blacks in this case, if they're committing the same types of crimes at the same similar rates, why are minority inmates being sentenced to death row more so than white inmates when all other factors are static, right? Or very similar in nature. So they're saying, what the court is basically saying is that you cannot continue to use the death penalty in these states until you actually do something to change the way in which the death penalty is being applied. So states take this and they say, oh my gosh, well, we're a state that wants to continue to use the death penalty, so what are we going to do to fix the system? So they're putting safeguards in place. They're putting things like automatic review in place and a bifurcated trial in which your guilt phase and your sentencing phase happen at different times. They're putting in caveats that say the aggravating circumstances have to outweigh the mitigating circumstances. So if you are a juvenile, that's a mitigating circumstance. If you killed 4 victims, that's an aggravating circumstance. So that aggravating circumstance might trump the fact that you are a juvenile. And we're talking in 1972 here, so the juvenile thing hasn't even been discussed yet. If you are mentally ill, that might be a mitigating factor. But can you prove that you are mentally ill at the exact time of the offense? And if you cannot prove that, then what are the aggravating factors that outweigh this, right? Who is the victim that you killed? How many individuals did die? What was the circumstance surrounding the offense? Things like that might be considered areas in which aggravating factors would come into play. So if you wanted to put the death penalty back on the books, these safeguards needed to go into effect. So 4 years after the Furman decision, the Supreme Court looks at the new implementation of the death penalty laws in different states, and in a second collective suit, CRIJ v. Georgia in 1976, the Supreme Court says, okay, now that you have changed the way in which the death penalty is being applied, now that you have changed all of these, or put all of these safeguards into place, we're going to allow the death penalty to be reinstated, and they rule that it is constitutional. In later cases, the Supreme Court then looked at a variety of different circumstances and said whether or not the application of the death penalty on specific offender groups was constitutional in nature. So in Coker v. Georgia and Kennedy v. Louisiana, we have two cases in which a crime was committed but the victim did not die, both of which happen to be sexual assault cases. The Coker case was against an adult female, and the Kennedy case was against a minor female. I think the child was like 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that. But the Supreme Court in both cases ruled that because the victim did not die, even though these crimes were very heinous and violent in nature, both victims survived. So because both victims survived, these cases were not death penalty eligible. You could go for life without the possibility of parole, but the death penalty was off the table if your victim does not die. In Roper v. Simmons, we see that the court rules that you have to be at least 18 years of age at the time of your offense to be executed. And in Atkins v. Virginia and Hall v. Florida, we have two cases that speak on the application of modern standards of mental illness and intellectual impairment, and whether or not those individuals can be executed. And these cases have stated that no, you cannot execute those who are mentally ill at the time of the offense or intellectually impaired based on modern standards set by the states. So states are fighting really hard to get the death penalty back in place, and SCOTUS is putting safeguards in place to say you can't execute based on these reasons. So now that we have a more modern system of the death penalty in terms of use, who is actually using these statutes the most? Because remember, it is not mandatory at all for states to use the death penalty, and the majority of the states actually don't have the death penalty at this point. I think it's probably at the time of the recording, it's probably around 33 states that do not have the death penalty in the country. But for those that do, we see the death penalty being implemented in terms of a cluster. So more than 60% of all executions come from 5 states: Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, Florida, and Missouri. Texas, and you're probably not surprised by this, it's a pretty common known fact, Texas is the big daddy of them all, and Texas is executing the majority of that 60%. But we're going to talk a little bit more about Texas in a minute. Since the death penalty has been reinstated in 1976, at the time of this recording, there have been 1,493 executions in the United States. In 2008, 25 executions occurred, and already in 2019, we've had 3 executions occur. And remember, this is just at the time of this recording, so depending on when you're watching this, those numbers may have changed. Of the 25 that occurred in 2018, 13 of them were from Texas, 2 from Florida, 2 from Alabama, 2 in Georgia, 1 in Ohio, 3 in Tennessee, 1 in Nebraska, and 1 in South Dakota. So again, we're seeing a trend in which Texas is leading the pack and has the most executions. Since 1976, and that's the date in which the CRIJ decision was reinstated, we've had 560 executions occur in Texas, and that accounts for 38% of the 1,493. So 38% of all executions are coming from Texas alone. So that old joke in which people say that Texas has an express line to the death chamber is ringing pretty true if you look at the statistics of it all. But if you then compare Texas to other states, California is maybe the dichotomy of Texas. And California has only executed 13 individuals from 1976, but they have one of the largest death rows in the country. And those 13 individuals that have been executed since 1976, again, the date of the CRIJ decision, all of those have actually occurred post-1992. The last individual that was executed in California was Clarence Allen, and that happened in 2006. So this recording is happening in 2019, so 13 years ago was the last time anybody was executed in the state of California. In March 2019, again, the time of this recording, the governor of California, a man named Gavin Newsom, actually signed an executive order that issues a reprieve to all 737 death row inmates in the state of California. And effectively what this does is it nullifies the use of the death penalty in that state. And it basically says the state itself is not willing to execute. The governor is not willing to authorize any of these death row sentences. It is still up to the citizens if they would like to vote this out. But essentially, Newsom has wiped the entire system clean of death row inmates. If the citizens decide they don't want to formally vote out the death penalty, all Newsom would have to do is every time somebody is admitted to death row, he could then nullify that sentence as well and vacate it and send them to life in prison with or without the possibility of parole. So even if the citizens decide they don't want to formally do this, as long as Newsom is the governor, he can continue to nullify and vacate these sentences. The last time this was up for a vote in 2016, the citizens of California decided they did not want to vote for the total elimination of the death penalty in the state, despite the fact that the state's not even using it. But they decided at that point in time they didn't want to. So we'll see what happens if this is brought up for a secondary revote. So in talking about California, if they're not formally using the death penalty, why are they even vacating these sentences? And essentially, California is following a trend of a handful of other states in which they have abolished the death penalty in 2000. And most states are just doing this for financial reasons. Executions are expensive. They are expensive. They are the most expensive type of sentence that we hand out in this country. And 737 people are sitting on death row, or were sitting on death row in California. So you can imagine how much money is being thrown at something that they're not even implementing. In recent studies looking at the cost of the death penalty in Oklahoma, economists have suggested that capital cases resulting in an execution result in a 3.2 times more expensive case than a non-capital one. California has spent over $4 billion on execution since 1976, and as they have recently vacated their 737 death row inmate sentences, this equates to roughly $5.4 million per case, give or take. In 2000, Florida releases a report, and they estimate that the cost that the state has to produce for each execution is $24 million. So from the time that the individual has been arrested to the time of execution, the state is spending $24 million on executions. And at the time of the report's release in Florida, they had only executed 44 individuals. So $24 million per individual for 44 individuals. Texas is a little less, and I think maybe that's because we have perfected, if you want to use that word, the use of the death penalty. But even here in Texas, it costs about $2.3 million per execution. And that basically equates to spending more than three times the amount of money it would take to house somebody in a maximum security solitary confinement cell for 40 years. So think about that. Even if you are not opposed to the death penalty for any moral reasons, or you think it's okay for the state to be able to be the one to execute, that's fine. I'm not here to change your opinion, but think about it from the monetary perspective, how much money we are spending to execute individuals. So California might be on this bandwagon. It's a lot of money, and if we're spending $5.4 million for each case, that's a lot of money that we don't necessarily have to spend on one unique individual. They might also be thinking about things from the procedural side. We know that there have been many problems with the implementation of the death penalty in this country over the years, and since 1973, the very first year after the death penalty was abolished, We've seen 164 individuals at the time of this recording who have been exonerated from death row alone. The number is a lot higher for the total number of individuals who have been exonerated from prisons across the country, but 164 reflects death row. So to be exonerated, if you've never heard this term before, an exoneration means we're talking about somebody who was convicted of a crime they didn't commit, or there was a procedural issue that violated your constitutional rights and the odds were stacked against you at trial. So either way, it results in a wrongful conviction for the offender. So when we're talking about things that are procedurally wrong, we're talking about things like eyewitness misidentification, law enforcement did something that was incorrect in terms of evidence collection, or the judge maybe allowed evidence through that they shouldn't have. Maybe the DNA was not present at the time and you were wrongfully convicted and you didn't actually do it, and now your exoneration is coming from the testing of DNA. But either way, you're sitting on death row for years and years and years for a crime that you did not commit, and you're waiting for an execution that is not meant for you. So if you're facing a punishment that is permanent, right? Once you're executed, we can't bring you back if we messed up. Whoops, sorry. This one is permanent and it cannot be changed once it's implemented. Can you imagine that if we know we've gotten 164 people off of death row that aren't supposed to be there, can you imagine that we've actually not caught one in time and that we've executed individuals who are innocent, who are actually innocent? Imagine it, because it has happened at least 13 times that we know of. At the time of this recording, we know with certainty that 13 individuals have been executed since 1972 who were executed but who were not actually guilty of the crime they committed. 9 of those 13 occurred here in Texas. Those two issues alone, the money and the idea that I'm on death row for something I haven't actually committed or I'm not guilty of, should at least make you think about the continued use of the death penalty. The last thing that I want to talk to you before I let you all go is the issue or the idea of botched executions. And this issue has caused the resurgence in arguments both for and against the death penalty in the last couple of years. We know that over time the method of execution has changed. We found more effective ways in which to execute people, more humane ways in which to execute people, and it changes over time. So over the history of the country, we've used hanging, and hanging results in a 3.12% botched execution rate. We've used electrocution. Electrocution has resulted in a 1.92% botched execution rate. Lethal gas is a little higher at 5.4%. Firing squad has resulted in a 0% botched execution rate, but only 34 people have been executed this way. So the number is a lot lower compared to other types. And finally, lethal injection, which is the most common modern way of execution, has resulted in a 7.12% botched execution rate, which is the highest for all of the execution types. So when we're talking about a botched execution, we simply mean that something happened during your execution that did not go according to plan, or that the execution did not go perfectly. So perhaps the inmate survived the first execution attempt. That has happened several times in this country. The drug cocktail for lethal injection was not used correctly. The execution squad had trouble finding a vein in which to insert the needle if we're talking about lethal injection. The dosage of the gas was incorrect for the inmate's body weight. Or if we're talking about electrocution, maybe the inmate caught on fire. If you want to talk about that a little bit, there is one famous man in Florida. There are 2 cases of botched execution that I want to talk about in terms of example, and then I'll let you guys go for the day. But the first one that we're talking about in terms of electrocutions happened in Florida with an inmate named Alan Tiny Davis. And Alan Davis was an inmate on Florida death row. Alan's nickname was Tiny, and it was kind of in that sarcastic way in which you would nickname a really small little dog Killer. That was Tiny, right? He was a very, very large man, and he weighed more than 350 pounds at the time of his execution. And the reason why we care about Mr. Allen, or I'm sorry, Mr. Davis, his first name is Allen, so Alan Davis, has to deal with his execution. At the time of his execution, it was in the early 2000s, I want to say maybe 2000 itself. The state of Florida had not yet made the formalized switch from the electric chair to lethal injection. And the old electric chair that they had for executions was the same one they've been using since 1924. And they kept having to fix it and update it and replacing parts over and over again, because you can imagine that if you're executing a bunch of people in the same chair, those parts are going to break down. Okay, so going back to the lethal injection thing, the state of Florida hadn't made the formalized change, but it was an option. So at this point in time, you could choose the electric chair, you could choose lethal injection. Tiny chose the electric chair, and he thought, the chair is so old and it is so narrow and I am so large that I won't fit in the chair. So Tiny decided what he's going to do is he's going to eat his way out of his execution. And he gained weight and he gained weight and he gained weight, and eventually he topped 350 pounds at the time of his execution, and he did not fit in the same chair that they've been using since 1924. So Tiny thought, okay, I won. I've beat the system. The other thing is that 2 years prior to Tiny's execution, the chair and the parts that they used to actually electrocute the inmate were breaking down so badly that the last inmate they executed caught on fire and was severely burned. So the state of Florida said, well, we've had these issues in the past with botched executions, and this man can't fit in the chair, so we're going to build a new chair. So that didn't actually go so well according to Tiny's plans, and Tiny actually becomes the very first one who is executed in the chair, and he's the only one who has been executed in the chair to date. And if you ever get a chance to go to Florida, if you go to Florida State Prison, which is in Stark, that you can actually go on a prison tour. And if there is no active warrant signed at the time, the correctional officers will allow you to tour the death chamber, and they'll allow you to sit in the chair. And this is something that I used to do with my classes back when I was at the University of Florida. And if you wanted to, you could sit in the chair. They wouldn't make you. It was all unplugged and everything, and it was just sitting in their break room. And correctional officers would eat lunch in the death chamber, or in the chair that was located just adjacent to the death chamber. And it was just a kind of a weird, wonky experience, but if you're interested in it and you ever get down that way, you're allowed to do it. So anyway, back to Tiny. So execution day arrives. Tiny has his last meal. They hook him up to the chair, begin the execution, and within seconds, Tiny Davis catches on fire, similar to the other inmate that caught fire a couple years ago. And flames start to shoot out the top of his head. There's a strong stench of a burning flesh that's permeating the room. And despite the fire, and I mean it's like a good size fire, the executioners keep running the generator to electrocute him so the execution can finish. Because in their minds, they're thinking, we can't do this twice. Even though he's on fire, we have to finish through, so he does not survive this. And Alan Davis's face is turning just this really dramatic shade of purple, and it's kind of purple and red in places, and he starts to bleed from his nose, like a lot. And it's running down his face and it's pooling on his chest, and there's just so much blood. His skin is charred. If you are electrocuted for your execution, they shave your head to be able to put the thing on there. All of the skin is burned on his face, on his head, on his neck. It's pretty charred. To the point where they have to shut down the chamber, because if you've ever seen, not that many of you have probably seen an execution, but if you've ever seen a death chamber, there's a separate room in which Witnesses can view the execution, and then there's the death chamber itself. There's a panel of glass in between, so they hurry up and shut the blinds so nobody can see what's going on. But the press have gotten word of what's happening, and the state of Florida has now executed 2 inmates in a row in which they have set on fire. So the state is basically saying we need to get ahead of this, and we need to release a report that talks about what actually went wrong in this execution. And the state decides that as part of that report, we're going to release photographs that look at Tiny Davis's body post-mortem. And you can find those online, but the state felt like they needed to do this in order to be able to show transparency because of the controversy that sort of occurred with the previous execution. So after Tiny's execution, the remaining inmates on death row in Florida petitioned the state and sued and said, this is cruel and unusual punishment. You just set 2 guys on fire. I'm next in line. There's no way in hell that you're going to light me on fire. So basically, Tiny's execution is the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, and Florida makes the formalized change to lethal injection. And this botched execution sort of forces their hand and forces them to convert. So if you want to go look at the pictures and you have a strong stomach, I encourage you to do so. They're not super terrible, but it is a dead body, so just that warning. And the report is out there in terms of transparency. The next inmate that I'm going to talk about is more recent, and Clayton Lockett is a gentleman in Oklahoma who was executed in 2014, and the execution, just to say the least, went as bad as humanly possible. And this one's a little bit more interesting because the state sort of locked down compared to how Florida was transparent and open, and Oklahoma locked it down, and they said, we're not really going to be talking too much about what happened, but witnesses from the execution went on to talk a little bit more about what they believed happened. So the cocktail that was used in Mr. Lockett's execution had never been used in the state of Oklahoma before, and Mr. Lockett was the guinea pig, so to speak. And to the point where Lockett's attorneys petitioned the Oklahoma State Supreme Court and saying, we don't know what these drugs are going to do. They haven't been used on a human in terms of execution before. These unknown conditions of the drugs sort of stopped the Oklahoma State Supreme Court, and they said, like, we agree with you. We don't know what this is going to do. It's never been used for execution before. And the governor put so much pressure on the state Supreme Court justices and threatened impeachment because they were trying to stop the execution and obstruct justice, that the Supreme Court had to fold and basically voted in favor of continuing the execution. However, when the day of the execution happened, the execution squad had so much trouble finding veins in Mr. Lockett's arms, they instead decided to go through his groin. I believe that Mr. Lockett used to be an intravenous drug user, and that was part of the problem. So instead of finding a vein in his groin, they actually nicked an artery, and blood started spurting out and hit the individual that was trying to insert the IV, but eventually that person did get the IV inserted. However, this was against all types of proper protocol. But the person who objected to this was overruled and the team went forward with the plan. And it turns out that part of the problem that they had was not only did they nick the artery, but the individual who was trying to insert the IV line had used the wrong size needle. A bigger needle was used compared to the smaller one that was needed for proper protocol to be taking place. It took 43 minutes for Mr. Lockett to be executed. If a lethal injection style execution takes place, once the drugs once the needle is inserted into the inmate, the execution should take no longer than 10 minutes. These drugs work fast. So once the needle is inserted, they immediately start the drug cocktail and the inmate should pass away rather peacefully. However, it took Mr. Lockett 43 minutes to die after the first drug of the cocktail was administered. And Witnesses report that Mr. Lockett woke up and that he was groaning and he writhed around and he actually lifted his head and his shoulders up off the gurney and he was saying, "Man, like this hurts." And again, once this started to occur, the state shut it down and closed the curtains between the witnesses and the execution chamber so that the journalist couldn't see it and his own team of attorneys could not finish watching the execution. And a medical doctor ran in, checked on Lockett, and said he is not dead, confirmed that he is still alive. And at this point in time, the doctor reports that Lockett actually tried to raise up a couple times, and they were trying to calm him down. Take deep breaths, calm yourself down. And as they tried to do that, he became more aggressive and tried to get up even more. So it just got really, really bad. In later reports, the paramedic that actually inserted the IV admitted to the fact that it was not the right one, that they hit the artery, that they nicked it, and that everything was just wrong from that point forward. They started the execution at 6 p.m. By 6:33, a doctor finally declared him unconscious. However, he was still he was definitely out of it, but he was still not to the point where he was going to pass away. There were still signs of life within him. And people who witnessed this basically just said, this thing was one of the most traumatizing things they have ever seen, and that it was like a horror movie, that they kept trying to execute him and the drugs were not working and the way they administered them to him were not taking effect, and then he was trying to talk, he was trying to get up. They kept hearing him moan. It sounded like he was in pain. I mean, with the first drug of the lethal injection cocktail, it's supposed to put you unconscious, and then you do not show any other signs of life after that. But reports are stating that he's in pain and he's trying to get off the gurney. He's confused. Nobody else knew what to do. We're trying to execute him, but we messed this up. Do we take him to the hospital? Do we finish the execution? He's in various states of consciousness and unconsciousness. Do we pull the IV and try to put another IV in line and start the whole process over again? So eventually the head of the execution team said, we're going to call it off. We're going to take him to the hospital. But as they're trying to do that, 43 minutes in, he actually has a massive coronary heart attack, and he dies of the heart attack rather than the lethal injection drugs. The drugs put so much stress on his body that his heart eventually had a heart attack, So it was one of the worst botched executions that the country had seen in some time. And critics have said the severe nature of how botched it really was makes the death penalty completely unnecessary. The execution team was not at all prepared or properly trained to administer the IV the way that they needed to, and they did not know how to handle the situation once they had messed up. After they nicked the artery, they should have shut it down, and they should have repaired the wound, and they should have tried again at a later date. But they continued on using improper protocols, and that was the start of what was a severely botched situation. Because of this botched execution, other inmates said, well, I'm next in line to use this drug either in Oklahoma or in other states, and this drug has never been reviewed before. So they then petitioned the Supreme Court of the United States, and they said, is this drug constitutional for the state to use? Because I do not want this type of botched execution to happen to me as well. Look at what happened to Clayton Lockett. The drug does not work. It does not make you unconscious the way that it's supposed to, and I don't want to be in pain doing this. So the Supreme Court actually did review the drug, and it was the drug cocktail rather, and it was ruled constitutional. So now states are permitted to use both a 3-drug and a 1-drug cocktail in their executions. But I don't feel like we need to get into the one drug as well because it was just a formalized review and it was deemed constitutional. So at this point, I have probably overwhelmed you with the amount of information surrounding the death penalty. And this is really me just barely getting started covering this topic. There's so much more that we could get into, but I don't want to have you here for 3-4 hours at a time. So I'm going to stop the lecture and focus more on wrapping things up at this point. So as we know, the death penalty is still widely used, but support among community members is really waning, and that part of it is continually decreasing. So the popularity of this type of crime or type of sentence is decreasing among citizens, but states are still continuing to use it. And I think as we continue to botch executions and as we continue to execute more people and as we continue to spend a lot of money executing few people compared to the whole general criminal justice system, I think people are getting tired of supporting something that doesn't actually work to begin with. We know that the death penalty does not deter people from committing homicides, and research even suggests that every time a execution takes place, there is a spike in the homicide rate in that state and surrounding areas. So the death penalty is not deterring, and it's actually creating more of a problem than it is meant to, right? So if all of these things are showing that the death penalty doesn't work, then states are slowly, one by one, losing the death penalty or eliminating it in their states. But like I said, I could go on for days, so I'm just going to stop now. But at this point, we are very quickly running out of weeks in the semester. There are only 2 more lectures left until we reach the end of the content for this term. Next week, what we're going to do is take a look at the war on drugs and the impacts that those types of policies have had on incarceration. And then the final week of the semester, in terms of content, we're going to speak to innovations in correctional policies. So thank you guys for your time and your attention today. I know that this was a dense lecture. Excuse me. And then I look forward to seeing you back here next week when we tackle the war on drugs. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Thanks. See you. Bye.